My name is Delia Fontaine. I am 46 years old. On a Thursday evening in October, 5 years ago, I sat in my attorney's office in Savannah, Georgia, across from a woman named Patricia Howe, who had been practicing estate law for 27 years, and she placed a document on the desk between us and asked me whether I recognized it. I recognized it immediately. It was a copy of the document I had signed on the evening of my engagement, 5 years and 8 months earlier, sitting in my future mother-in-law's formal dining room in Charleston, South Carolina, with a glass of celebratory champagne in my hand and my newly engaged left hand resting on the table, and the diamond that Graham had just placed on it, catching the light from the chandelier above. I had signed it that evening because Graham's stepfather, a man named Harrison Beauchamp, who was a retired banker and who had the specific quality of retired bankers who have spent 40 years being the most financially informed person in any room, had presented it to me with the explanation that it was a standard beneficiary designation form, the kind that all of Graham's family members signed when joining the Beauchamp family circle, a form that designated me as Graham's beneficiary in the event of his death, and that required my signature as a formality. He had said it quickly, with the specific pace of someone who has explained something many times and who expects the explanation to be sufficient. I had signed it. Patricia Howe looked at me across the desk and said, "Delia, this is not an insurance beneficiary form. This is a prenuptial agreement, and it is one of the most comprehensive documents of its kind I have seen in 27 years of practice. I want to tell you what happens after that sentence. But first I need to take you to the beginning, because the beginning is where the specific shape of everything that happened afterward was already present, and because the beginning is the place where I first understood the particular kind of family I had married into, which is to say the kind that understood information as a resource to be allocated according to who had earned the right to it, rather than according to who needed it. I grew up in Valdosta, Georgia, the second of 3 daughters born to Raymond and Louise Fontaine, who had met at a church social in 1974 and married the following year, and built the specific life that working-class Georgia families of that generation built, organized around steady employment and genuine faith, and the particular pride of people who do not have very much in the material sense, but who have built something real in the sense that actually matters. My father drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor for 31 years. My mother worked the checkout at the Piggly Wiggly on Patterson Street for 22 years, and then, when her knees gave her the specific trouble that standing on concrete for 8 hours a day for 2 decades eventually gives knees, she took a job in the school cafeteria at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house, which paid less, but allowed her to sit when she needed to, and which she did for 11 more years until she retired. They were people of genuine specific goodness, the particular goodness that does not announce itself because it has never needed to. The goodness of people who do what needs doing without requiring recognition for the doing. My father helped the neighbors when things needed fixing. My mother brought food when people were sick. They went to church every Sunday, and they meant it in the specific way of people for whom faith is not a social convention, but the actual organizing principle of how they understand the world and their responsibilities within it. I was not the most academically distinguished of their 3 daughters. That was my older sister Rosalind, who went to UGA on academic scholarship and became a pharmacist in Augusta. I was not the most socially gifted. That was my younger sister Petra, who had the particular warm magnetic quality of someone whose social intelligence is the most fully developed aspect of their personality. I was the specific one in between, neither distinctly academic nor distinctly social, but possessed of what my high school guidance counselor described as an unusual combination of persistence and emotional intelligence, which she said in the particular way of guidance counselors describing a student whose path is not yet clear, and who therefore requires a description that leaves the path open. I went to Georgia Southern for a degree in hospitality management, the specific pragmatic choice of someone who understood that she was going to need to make her own way, and who had identified an industry where genuine competence was visible and compensable in ways she could access without the specific social capital that some fields required. I graduated and got a job in Savannah, at a boutique hotel on the waterfront that catered to the specific clientele of people who could afford not to stay at the Marriott. And I spent 8 years learning the hospitality business from the inside, with the particular focused attention of someone for whom the work was not a temporary position on the way to something else, but the actual thing she had decided to be good at. By the time I was 32, I was the director of guest experience for a property that was considered one of the finest small hotels in the southeastern United States. I had built a reputation in the specific small world of Southern boutique hospitality that was built on the particular quality of my work, rather than on who I knew or where I had gone to school, or any of the other forms of credential that the world sometimes substitutes for actual competence. I was proud of what I had built, specifically quietly, without making a production of the pride, which is the specific way that people who were raised the way I was raised tend to carry pride, internally, rather than as a social broadcast. I met Graham Beauchamp at a charity fundraiser for the Savannah Land Trust in September of the year I turned 33. He was 38, a third-generation real estate developer from Charleston, who had expanded the family's operations into Savannah 5 years earlier and who had the specific particular quality of South Carolina low-country money that I had not previously encountered in Valdosta or in the Georgia Southern Hospitality Management Program, which was a quality of ease so deeply habitual that its holder had stopped being able to distinguish between ease and entitlement because the two had been indistinguishable in every context he had ever occupied. He was also genuinely charming in a way that was not entirely performance, the specific charm of someone who had been required to be pleasant his entire life and who had discovered somewhere along the way that he actually enjoyed being pleasant, and that genuine enjoyment of it was different from its performed version in ways that other people could feel. He asked me about the hotel. Not the hotel as a venue for a real estate conversation, but the hotel as a thing I had built that he found interesting. He asked specific questions, and he listened to the answers with the specific quality of someone who is actually processing what they are hearing, rather than waiting for the space in the conversation where they can say something. I went home that evening and told my friend and colleague Marcia, who had attended the fundraiser with me, that I had met someone interesting. She said, "Is he cute?" I said, "That's not why he's interesting." She said, "So is he cute?" I said, "Yes, but that's not why he's interesting." We dated for 14 months before the engagement. The 14 months were the specific 14 months of a relationship that is building towards something while also being genuinely good in the present tense, not straining toward a future, but real in each of its months. The specific accumulation of two people finding out whether what they have is what they think it is. What I found out across those 14 months was a series of things about Graham that I want to describe honestly, because the honest description is necessary to understanding what happened later. I found out that he was genuinely kind, in the specific ordinary ways that genuine kindness manifests when someone is not performing it for an audience. He remembered things I told him and acted on the remembering. He was patient with the specific impatience of service industry work in ways that many people of his background and generation were not patient. He was embarrassed by the specific forms of entitlement that his background had installed in him in ways he had not chosen, the occasional reflexive assumption that certain things should simply be available, and the embarrassment was genuine rather than performed. I also found out, more gradually, that he had a specific and complicated relationship to his family that I want to describe with the care it deserves because it is directly relevant to what happened later. Graham's father had died when Graham was 11, a cardiac event that came without warning, and that reorganized the Beauchamp family around the specific gravity of absence and the specific presence of Harrison, who had been his mother Eleanor's second husband since Graham was 14. Harrison Beauchamp was not a cruel man and was not an unkind stepfather in any direct or intentional sense. He was a specific kind of man who had spent 40 years in banking and who had developed, in those 40 years, a relationship to information, financial and otherwise, that was organized entirely around control. He understood information as the primary form of power available to people who possessed it, and he managed information accordingly, releasing it to those who needed it when he determined they needed it, rather than when they might independently conclude they needed it. Eleanor, Graham's mother, had organized herself around Harrison across 30 years of marriage in the specific way of women who have experienced the specific vulnerability of widowhood with young children and who have chosen a strong and capable partner, partly because strength and capability felt like security after the terrifying fragility of being alone. She was warm and socially skilled, and she loved Graham in the specific way of mothers whose love has been tested by loss and who have been somewhat overprotective as a result of that testing. She was also, I came to understand gradually, someone whose own access to information within the marriage was managed by Harrison in ways she had accepted so thoroughly that she had stopped noticing the management. I did not see this clearly in the 14 months of dating. I saw the surface, which was a warm and welcoming family with a specific quality of social ease that was different from anything in my own background, but that was not unwelcoming. Eleanor embraced me, genuinely, I believe, from our first meeting. Harrison was cordial and specific, and occasionally surprising in his apparent interest in my work and in my family's background, the interest of someone who is conducting an assessment and who is interested in what the assessment turns up. I did not understand the assessment as an assessment. I understood it as interest. The engagement happened on a Saturday evening in August, at a restaurant in Savannah that Graham had chosen, because I had mentioned it once, 4 months earlier, as a place I had always wanted to go, but had not been able to justify on a hotel director's salary, and he had remembered it and reserved it and planned the evening around it with the specific attentiveness that had been one of the things that made me fall in love with him. He proposed in the garden of the restaurant, under the specific Spanish moss and lantern light of a Savannah August evening, with a ring that had been his grandmother's, and that Eleanor had given him with the specific warm symbolism of a family passing something forward. I said yes in the specific way of someone who has already known for several months that she was going to say yes, but who is still moved by the specific moment of the asking. We called my family that evening. We called Eleanor and Harrison. The following weekend we drove to Charleston. Eleanor had organized a celebration dinner at the Beauchamp House on East Battery Street, the specific house that had been in the family since Eleanor's parents bought it in 1958, and that communicated, in its specific architecture and location, and the particular quality of its furnishings, everything about the Beauchamp family's position in Charleston society that the family had chosen not to say explicitly. The dinner was 12 people, family and the specific close friends of the Beauchamp family who were present at occasions of this significance. Eleanor had arranged flowers and had cooked with help from the woman who came twice a week, and the evening had the specific quality of a family welcoming someone new in a way that was genuine and also organized. The warmth real, and the organization also real, and both things present simultaneously. After dinner, after the dessert and the toasts and the specific circulating warmth of a family celebrating, Harrison asked if he could speak with Graham and me in the study. This was not unusual in the context of the evening. Harrison was the family patriarch in the specific functional sense that the Beauchamp family had organized itself around him across 30 years, and his pulling Graham and me aside for a private conversation had the quality of something expected, rather than something surprising. We went to the study. It was the specific kind of Charleston study that this specific house contained, dark wood and built bookshelves and a desk that communicated the particular solidity of things acquired across generations rather than purchased for effect. Harrison sat behind the desk. Graham sat in one of the 2 chairs facing it. I sat in the other. Harrison said, "I want to go over some housekeeping with you both before the evening gets away from us. Estate planning matters, nothing dramatic. just the kind of thing that needs to be addressed when the family circle changes. He was specific and organized, and his tone was the particular tone of someone who does this often and who has learned that the most efficient way to handle it is to present it as routine, which communicates that the appropriate response is to receive it as routine. He produced a document. 3 pages. He placed it on the desk in front of me. He said, "This is a standard beneficiary designation form that the family's estate attorney prepares when new family members join the Beauchamp circle. What it does is designate you as Graham's beneficiary in the various estate instruments that currently name a previous beneficiary from before the engagement. It protects you by making sure that if something happened to Graham before the wedding, you would be provided for," he said. "It's entirely standard. Graham signed his version last week when he and I met with the attorney. We just need your signature to complete the documentation." He placed a pen on top of the document. I looked at the document. It was 3 pages of dense legal language. I am not an attorney, and I had not had any particular occasion to read legal documents of this kind in my professional life, and the language was the specific language of legal documents that is designed to be unambiguous in its technical meaning and is therefore largely inaccessible to anyone without legal training. Harrison had described it as a beneficiary designation form. Graham was sitting beside me, and he did not say anything that contradicted this description. I looked at Graham. He said, "It's fine. Harrison took me through it with the attorney last week." I signed it. I signed it on the 3rd page, in the space where Harrison pointed, and I dated it, and Harrison picked it up with the specific efficiency of someone completing a task, and the evening continued, and the champagne was refilled, and the dessert plates were cleared. I did not think about the document again for 5 years and 8 months. I want to tell you about those 5 years and 8 months, because they are the specific years in which I built a life and a marriage that I believed was what it appeared to be, and because understanding what I built in those years is necessary to understanding what it meant to learn, in Patricia Howe's office, what I had signed on the evening of my engagement. Graham and I were married the following June, at a ceremony in Charleston that was, by any reasonable description, beautiful. St. Michael's Church, because the Beauchamps had been married at St. Michael's for 4 generations, and Eleanor had the specific investment in continuity that comes from families for whom certain traditions are not matters of preference, but of identity. I had wanted a smaller ceremony in Savannah, closer to my own family and my own world, and we had had the specific gentle negotiation of a couple reconciling different expectations about the shape of a wedding, and the outcome had been St. Michael's for the ceremony and a reception in Savannah the following weekend for our friends and my family. I did not register at the time that the outcome of the negotiation placed the official ceremony in Charleston and the informal celebration in Savannah, which communicated something specific about whose world was primary and whose was secondary, though the communication was gentle and not intentional in any malicious sense, and I did not receive it as malicious then or now. I moved to Charleston. This was the second negotiation about where we would live, and the outcome was Graham's city rather than mine, which was both logistically reasonable. His business was there, his family was there, and also the specific again of a pattern I was not yet fully seeing. I left the hotel director position in Savannah. Hotel director. This was not something I was asked to do and was not something Graham suggested. It was my own decision, made from a combination of the practical reality that my career in Savannah was not transferable to Charleston in any simple way, and the specific romantic naivety of someone who believed that the right marriage made certain sacrifices worth making without fully calculating the specific cost of the sacrifices. I found work in Charleston in the hospitality sector, though not at the level I had built in Savannah. Charleston's specific hotel market was organized around relationships and credentials that were local and that I had not built, and I spent the first 2 years in a role that was several levels below where I had been, rebuilding in a new context with the patient-specific competence that had served me in Savannah. Harrison and Eleanor were a regular presence in our lives in the specific ways that happen when family lives in the same city and when one member of the couple has a 30-year relationship with that family. Sunday dinners at East Battery Street. Holidays, which were organized by Eleanor with the focused attention she brought to all occasions of significance. The particular small occasions of a family that stays in each other's regular orbit, the birthday lunches and the charity events and the specific gatherings that have no formal occasion, but that maintain the texture of ongoing close relationship. I was in these years happy. I want to say this directly because it matters to the full shape of the story, because the story could be read, without this, as a story about a relationship that was bad from its inception, and that is not what it was. Graham was a good husband to me in the years of our marriage. He was present and attentive, and he had continued, across the years, to be the specific person I had fallen in love with, the person who remembered things I had said months ago, and who treated my work and my perspective with genuine respect, and who was, in the private specific texture of our daily life together, the person I had chosen to be with, and would have continued choosing. The marriage had specific difficulties. They were, looking back, the specific difficulties of a marriage in which one person has significantly more social and financial capital than the other within their shared world, and in which the family of the person with more capital has organized their expectations and their family structures around that capital in ways that the person with less capital does not have full visibility into. Harrison was not unkind to me across those 5 years. He was specific and occasionally warm and consistently cordial. He included me in the appropriate family occasions. He did not condescend directly. What he did was maintain the specific information management that I came to understand was the organizing principle of how he operated within the family, which meant that I had access to exactly the information that Harrison determined I needed, and not more. I did not understand this clearly until Patricia Howe's office. The appointment with Patricia Howe came about through a specific chain of events that I want to describe accurately because each event in the chain matters. Graham's uncle died in March of our 5th year of marriage. Uncle Cyrus, Harrison's older brother, a bachelor who had spent his adult life in commercial law and who left a specific and complicated estate that required, according to the attorney managing it, the involvement of all family members with potential interests in the estate for an informational meeting. Graham and I went together to the informational meeting at the Beauchamp family's estate attorney's office, a man named Frederick Wells, whose firm had handled Beauchamp family matters for 2 decades. The meeting was formal and specific, and went through the estate's composition in the particular language of estate attorneys, that is precise and somewhat impenetrable to people without legal backgrounds. At one point, Frederick Wells, in describing the various instruments that would be affected by Cyrus's death, referenced a document that had my name in it, in a way that I did not fully understand, but that caught my attention. I asked him to clarify. He looked at Harrison, not at me. At Harrison. Harrison said, "Frederick, we can address the specifics offline." Frederick Wells moved to the next item on the agenda. I noted the look between them. I noted Harrison's response. I did not know what to do with what I noted, so I noted it and continued with the meeting. On the drive home from the meeting, I asked Graham what Frederick had been about to say when Harrison interrupted. Graham said, "It was just estate stuff. Harrison will explain it when he's ready." I said, "When he's ready, not when I need to know." Graham said, "It's complicated estate stuff, Delia. Harrison manages all of this. That's always been how the family handles it." I said, "Graham." My name was in a document Frederick was about to discuss. He looked at Harrison before answering my question about it, and Harrison stopped him. "I want to know what's going on." Graham was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I'll talk to Harrison." He talked to Harrison. He came back and told me that the document Frederick had referenced was related to the premarital agreement and that the Cyrus estate situation had created a question about one of its provisions and that Harrison and the attorneys were working through it and would explain when everything was clear. I said, "Graham, premarital agreement." What premarital agreement? He looked at me. He said, the one you signed before we got married. I said, I signed a beneficiary designation form. He said, the prenuptial agreement that Harrison presented as part of the estate documentation. When we were in Charleston, I looked at my husband, he said, in Harrison's study. The evening of the engagement dinner, I said, very carefully and very specifically, Graham. I signed what Harrison told me was a beneficiary designation form. He explained it as standard family documentation to designate me as your beneficiary. He did not describe it as a prenuptial agreement, and I did not understand it to be a prenuptial agreement. Graham looked at me with an expression I want to describe precisely because it is the specific expression of someone who has just encountered information that reorganizes something they had believed was settled. He said, "What did you think you were signing?" I said, "An insurance beneficiary form." That is what Harrison told me it was. Graham was very still. He said, "He told you it was a beneficiary form." I said, "Yes, those were the words he used." He said, "When I signed mine, the attorney explained it to me as a prenuptial agreement." Harrison was there. "I thought you had received the same explanation." I said, "I had a glass of champagne in my hand, and your stepfather told me I was signing a form that would protect me if something happened to you. Those are not the same thing." I want to tell you about the 3 days between that conversation in the car and the appointment with Patricia Howe, because those 3 days are the specific days when I built the understanding that made the appointment possible. I did not sleep well across those 3 days. Not because I was frightened in any acute way, but because I was doing the specific work of recalibrating a large body of information against a new framework. The work of taking 5 years of marriage and the specific texture of 5 years of family and running it through the particular filter of what I had just learned or what I believed I had just learned, and seeing what it looked like from the other side. What I recalibrated across those 3 days included the following: the engagement evening and Harrison's speed in presenting the document and his specific description of it as routine family documentation. Recalibrated. The decision to marry at St. Michael's rather than in Savannah. Still its own thing, but recalibrated in the context of a relationship where the family's framework for my place in it had been established on the evening of the engagement without my full knowledge or consent. The specific quality of information management that characterized my relationship with Harrison and Eleanor. The particular dynamic of my access to family information being allocated according to someone else's determination of what I needed rather than my own. The conversation in the car from the attorney's meeting, in which Graham had said Harrison will explain it when he's ready. A sentence I had heard before in various forms across 5 years. The particular framing that made Harrison the source and the timing of information, and placed everyone else in the position of receiving it on his schedule. I built this picture carefully, across 3 days, and I held it against the alternative picture, the one in which Harrison had described the document as what it was, and I had misunderstood, and I assessed the 2 possibilities with the specific honesty that the situation required. I did not reach a definitive conclusion about which picture was accurate. I reached a definitive conclusion that I needed to see the document I had signed with someone who could tell me what it actually said. I found Patricia Howe through a friend who was a practicing attorney in Savannah, and who, when I described the situation without describing the family involved, said, "I need you to call Patricia Howe because Patricia Howe is the specific person you need for this." Patricia Howe was 54 years old at the time of our first meeting, a woman of specific and contained authority, the particular authority of someone who has spent 27 years mastering the specific field that gives her authority and who no longer needs to perform the mastery, because the mastery simply is. She reviewed the document before I arrived. She had it on her desk when I came in. She placed it in front of me and asked me whether I recognized it. I recognized it. She said, Delia, this is not an insurance beneficiary form. This is a prenuptial agreement, and it is one of the most comprehensive documents of its kind I have seen in 27 years of practice. I looked at it. She said, I want to walk you through what it says, and I want to do it carefully because this is a significant amount of information, and I want you to understand each provision before we move to the next one. She walked me through it carefully. It took 2 hours. The document I had signed on the evening of my engagement, at a desk in a Charleston study on East Battery Street, with a glass of champagne and a new ring on my hand, and Harrison's specific voice describing it as standard family documentation, was a comprehensive prenuptial agreement that addressed every form of financial asset, real property, business interest, trust interest, inheritance, and financial instrument in which Graham had an interest or in which the Beauchamp family had an interest, and that established in specific legal language that was thoroughly designed to be enforceable, that in the event of divorce or separation I would have no claim to any of these assets beyond a specific and relatively modest sum that had been calculated according to a formula Patricia described to me as unusually structured in the specific sense that it bore the marks of considerable attorney time and thought. She said, "This is not a form document." This took significant attorney time to prepare. The provisions are specific and sophisticated, and they are comprehensive in a way that forms are not. I said, "He told me it was a beneficiary designation form." She said, "I heard you." I said, "He described it as documentation that would protect me if something happened to Graham." He used the word protect. She said, "What he described and what you signed are two different documents with two entirely different purposes." She said, "The document he described, a beneficiary designation form, would have made you Graham's beneficiary in his existing financial instruments. It would have given you more in the event of his death." She said, "The document you signed does the opposite in the context of a divorce. It limits your financial interests significantly." I said, "Graham signed something too." That night, she said, "Did you see what he signed?" I said, "No." Harrison said Graham had signed his version the week before at the attorney's office. She said, if Graham was presented with this document by his family attorney and told it was a prenuptial agreement and he understood what he was signing, then the situation regarding his knowledge is different from the situation regarding yours? I said, "You're saying he may have known what I was signing." She said, "I'm saying the document's existence and the circumstances under which it was executed raise specific questions that you need to have answered." I sat in Patricia Howe's office for a long time after she finished walking me through the document. She said, "I want to ask you something directly." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you want to challenge this document?" I looked at her. I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "What do you need to figure that out?" I said, "I need to know what Graham knew, and when." I want to tell you about the conversation with Graham, because it is the specific conversation that determined everything that came after it, and because it is the most important conversation of this story. I drove home from Patricia Howe's office. Graham was there when I arrived. He had been home since the afternoon, something I noticed in the specific way of someone who has been told by a text that their spouse is meeting with an estate attorney this morning and who understands that the evening's conversation is going to be significant. He was in the kitchen. I went to the kitchen. I said, "Patricia Howe spent 2 hours explaining to me what I signed in your stepfather's study on the night of our engagement." He said, "Delia." I said, "Let me say it." He said, "Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead." I said, "I signed a prenuptial agreement. A comprehensive, specifically designed prenuptial agreement that limits my financial interests in the Beauchamp family assets and in your assets in the event of divorce. I signed it believing it was a beneficiary designation form that would protect me if something happened to you, because that is what Harrison told me it was." He was very still. I said, "I need you to tell me, specifically and truthfully, what you knew about what I was signing that evening. He said nothing for a long time. Long enough that I understood the length of his silence was its own specific communication. He said, I knew it was a prenuptial agreement. I said, did you know I did not know? He said, I assumed you had been explained it the same way I had been. I should have verified that. I said, Graham, did you know or suspect that I had not been given an accurate description of what I was signing? He did not answer immediately. He said, Harrison told me he would take care of the explanation with you. I let him take care of it. I said, what does that mean specifically? He said, it means I knew Harrison was going to explain the document to you, and I did not verify what he said. I trusted him to handle it. I said, and when we drove home that night, when I had signed it, did you believe I had understood what I had signed? He was quiet again. He said, I thought maybe you just weren't asking a lot of questions because you trusted the family. I said, Graham. He said, I know. I said, you knew what you were signing. You let me sign something different without verifying that I understood what it was. He said, I didn't think. I said, you didn't think. That is the most accurate thing you've said. He said I should have verified. I should have asked you afterward what you understood you had signed. I didn't because it was easier not to, and because Harrison said he had handled it, and I trusted him to have handled it the way he said he would. I said, he didn't handle it the way he said he would, or he handled it exactly the way he intended to. He said, I don't know which of those is true. I said, I think you might have an idea. He said nothing. I said, I need you to answer me one more thing. He said, yes. I said, did you want me to sign a prenuptial agreement? He was quiet for the longest time yet. He said, Harrison said it was what the family always did, that it was standard. I didn't think about whether I independently wanted it because Harrison framed it as something that just happened. I said, that is not an answer to the question I asked. He said, I didn't want to not marry you, and I let Harrison handle the parts that felt complicated, because he said he would handle them, and handling complicated things has always been how it works in this family. I said, that is still not an answer to the question I asked. He said, I don't know if I independently would have asked you to sign something like that. I think I probably would not have. I don't know. I said, that might be the most honest thing you've said tonight. I left the kitchen. I went to the bedroom and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I held the specific weight of everything that had just been said in the way that you hold things that are too large to process immediately, simply carrying them while the carrying happens. I want to tell you what I decided, because I think the decision is the most important part of this story. I met with Patricia Howe 2 more times over the following 6 weeks. In those meetings, we discussed the specific legal landscape in which I found myself, the enforceability of the document, the specific circumstances of its execution, the particular question of whether a document signed under a material misrepresentation of its nature was enforceable in South Carolina, the relevant case law, the specific strength of my position if I chose to challenge it. Patricia said, you have a reasonable case. The circumstances of the execution are unusual, and the description Harrison gave you was materially inaccurate. Whether a court would void the agreement depends on a number of factors, including Graham's knowledge and the level of coercion that could be established. It is not a certain outcome either way. She said, before you decide anything, I want to make sure you've thought clearly about what you want, not what you're entitled to, what you want. I said, I want to understand why this happened. She said, that's a different question from whether to challenge the document. I said, I know. I went home and I had another conversation with Graham, the second of the specific conversations that mattered. And this conversation was different from the first one because Graham came to it differently than he had come to the kitchen conversation. He said, I've been thinking about what happened that night for 6 weeks, and I want to tell you something honestly. I said, all right. He said, I let Harrison handle the explanation because I let Harrison handle everything in my family, and I have done that my entire adult life because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative was confronting a specific set of conversations with Harrison about what I wanted and what I believed was right, that I had been avoiding since I was 14 years old. He said, what Harrison did was wrong. He described the document inaccurately. He knew what the document was, and he described it in a way that removed your ability to make an informed decision about whether to sign it. I didn't know in that specific moment that this was happening, but I knew enough to have verified it, and I chose not to verify it because verifying it would have required me to be involved in something that Harrison had said he would handle. He said, that is the specific way I have participated in Harrison's management of information for 30 years, by not asking, by trusting that when Harrison said he had handled something, the handling was okay. I did not think through what okay meant, and I did not examine whether okay was the same thing as right. He said, I am sorry, specifically, for not verifying what you were told, for not asking you afterward what you understood you had signed, for 30 years of allowing Harrison to manage information in my family without examining what that management meant for the people on the other side of it. I looked at my husband for a long time. I said, what do you want to happen? He said, I want to annul the agreement, not because Patricia says you can challenge it successfully, because it was executed under a material misrepresentation, and that is not the foundation I want our marriage to stand on. I said, Harrison will fight it. He said, yes. I said, it will cost significant money and significant family conflict. He said, yes. I said, why do you want to do it anyway? He said, because I have been choosing the path of least resistance in my family for my entire adult life, and the path of least resistance led me to allowing my wife to sign a document she didn't understand because I trusted my stepfather to handle the explanation. I don't want to keep being that person. I said, is this about the agreement or about Harrison? He said, it's about both, and about who I want to be in this marriage going forward, which is not someone who lets Harrison handle the parts that feel complicated. I held what he said for a long time. I said, if we do this, it's going to change a lot of things. He said, I know. I said, your relationship with Harrison, Eleanor's position. He said, I know. I said, are you prepared for that? He said, I think the question of what I'm prepared for is less important than what is right. I looked at the man I had married, not the version of him that had allowed Harrison to handle the explanation. The version that was sitting across from me and telling me who he wanted to be. I said, let me think about it. I want to tell you what I decided and why, because the why is the most important part. I did not challenge the agreement. I want to explain this decision carefully because it is the decision that most requires explanation, the one that people who hear this story find most surprising and sometimes most frustrating. I did not challenge it because of what I understood after 6 weeks of meetings with Patricia Howe and 2 significant conversations with Graham about what the challenge would actually accomplish and what it would cost. The challenge would potentially have voided an agreement that had been executed under a material misrepresentation. It would have established a legal record of what Harrison had done. It would have resulted in a more equitable financial arrangement in the event of divorce, but I was not planning to divorce Graham. I had spent 6 weeks understanding the situation with the specific clarity that the situation required, and what I understood was this. My husband had participated in something wrong by omission rather than commission, through the specific long-established pattern of allowing Harrison to manage the parts that felt complicated rather than through any intention to deceive me. His participation had cost me something. The conversation we had had was the most honest conversation of our marriage, and it had produced something I had not had before, which was Graham's specific named acknowledgement of a pattern he had been living inside without examining, and his stated intention to change that pattern. The challenge, if we pursued it, would create a legal war with Harrison that would consume the family for years, would cost significant money and emotional energy, and would produce a financial outcome that addressed the hypothetical scenario of a divorce I was not anticipating and did not want. What I wanted was a different foundation for the marriage I was already in, and what Graham was offering me was exactly that. I told Patricia how I was not going to challenge the document. She said, "That's your right." I said, "I know. I want you to draw up something else." She said, "What?" I said, "I want a document that Graham signs voluntarily with full legal counsel that sets aside the prenuptial agreement by mutual consent. Not because I challenged it and won, because he and I have decided together that the circumstances of its execution don't reflect the foundation we want our marriage to stand on." Patricia said, "That's an unusual thing to ask for." I said, "He offered it. I'm accepting it." She said, "Harrison is not going to agree to this." I said, "Harrison doesn't sign the document." She said, "He will make it as difficult as possible for Graham." I said, "I know." She said, "Delia, I want to make sure you understand the financial implications of not challenging. If your marriage ends," I said, "I understand." She said, "And you're choosing this anyway." I said, "I'm choosing what Graham offered, which is the marriage on a foundation that reflects what we actually agreed to. What happened with Harrison is not simple and is not entirely resolved, and I want to tell it honestly, rather than as a clean narrative of triumph." Harrison opposed the mutual agreement. He was specific and strategic in his opposition, involving family attorneys and raising questions about Graham's capacity to make this decision, and eventually, in a conversation that Graham described to me afterward as the most difficult conversation of his adult life, saying directly that Graham was making a choice that would have permanent consequences for his position in the family. Graham said, "I know." Harrison said, "You are choosing a woman you've known for 7 years over a family you've known for 44 years. Graham said, "I'm choosing to stand by something I believe is right over something I know is wrong. The woman has something to do with it. But not only the woman. The mutual agreement was signed 4 months after my first meeting with Patricia Howe. Graham was represented by an attorney who was not associated with the Beauchamp family. The agreement was signed with full independent counsel and with the specific, comprehensive process that Patricia had required to ensure it was enforceable. Harrison did not come to the signing. Eleanor did not know the signing was happening until afterward. The relationship with Harrison is different now. Not severed, not warm, specifically careful in the way of two people who understand each other's positions and who have accepted that understanding without resolving it. Family occasions are managed with the specific politeness of people who have been through something and who have agreed implicitly not to continue it publicly. Eleanor was confused and then sad, and then, across the following year, specifically warmer to me than she had been before, in a way I understood as the particular warmth of someone who has come to understand something they had not understood before, and who is expressing the understanding through the specific medium of increased warmth rather than explicit acknowledgement. Graham is different. Not completely different because a person is not completely different in the span of a year. Specifically different in the ways that matter. He asks more questions than he used to. He is more likely to verify than to trust. He has had specific conversations with Harrison about specific other instances of information management within the family that I was not privy to, and that I am not asking about, because they are between Graham and his stepfather, and not mine to know. He is also more present in the marriage in the specific way of someone who has examined the patterns he was operating inside, and who is making different choices within the same circumstances. Not perfect, specifically better. We are still married. Here is what a beneficiary designation form that was not a beneficiary designation form taught me. I know that information, withheld or misrepresented in a specific moment, is not simply that moment's problem. It is the foundation on which everything subsequent is built. And when the foundation is wrong, the building is wrong even when the building looks fine from the outside. I built 5 years of marriage on a specific misunderstanding of what I had agreed to. The building looked fine. The foundation was wrong. I know that the specific pattern of allowing someone else to manage the complicated parts, because it is easier than the alternative, is a pattern that does not stay confined to the situation it develops in. Harrison managing the Beauchamp family's information became Harrison managing the explanation to his stepson's fiancée, became me signing a document I did not understand, became 5 years of a marriage standing on a foundation that had not been fully honest. One person's pattern, extended across a family and a marriage, becomes everyone's problem eventually. I know that the choice to not challenge the document was not the choice that addressed what had been done to me. It was the choice that addressed what I wanted the marriage to be. Those are different questions with different answers, and the fact that the second question's answer led me to decline to pursue the first question's remedy does not mean the first question's answer didn't matter. Harrison did something wrong. That is true, and it remains true regardless of what I chose to do about it. And I know that Graham's offer, the specific offer to annul the prenuptial agreement by mutual consent on the grounds that its execution had not reflected the actual agreement between us, was the most specific form of accountability available to him in the situation, and that his making it, at the cost of significant conflict with the most powerful person in his family, told me something about who he was choosing to be that mattered more to me than the document itself. I am 46 years old. I have been married for 11 years now, 6 of them before I knew what I had signed, and 5 of them after. The 5 after are the ones I chose with full information. I would choose them again. That is my story. A glass of champagne, a 3-page document, a pen in my hand, and a specific description of what I was signing that was not what I was signing. And 5 years of learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the foundation of something matters more than the building that stands on it. If this reminded you of a moment when someone gave you information that was not the full information, and of what it cost you and what you did when you found out, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that you can love someone and still name what was done wrong and still choose what you choose with clear eyes. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.